Writing multiple POV novels is one of my passions in life. I absolutely love it. And I have multiple books that have lots of different POVs, including this series, the Eternal Sorrow series, which has 7 main points of view and sometimes an 8th POV. I love it. It is so much fun to be able to show your story from multiple perspectives. But I know that writing in multiple POV can often feel a little bit overwhelming and a little bit daunting. So today I'm going to give you 9 great tips for how to write multiple POV, and then I'm going to actually show you how I am currently organizing my novel, The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw, which has 8 points of view. So let's get started. Before we go over the tips on how to write multiple POV, it's important to understand what multiple POV actually is. So POV stands for point of view. And when we're talking about a character's point of view, we're not just talking about they appear in dialogue or we see them through the main character's eyes. What we're talking about when we say POV is that we are actually telling a piece of the story from that person's perspective, as if the reader is inside that person's head or is following that person very closely. So when you have a point of view, it means we're hearing their thoughts, we're seeing everything they're doing, and we're seeing the world through this person's eyes. So this can be anywhere from 2 points of view in a story to dozens. If some fantasy novels will sometimes have an omniscient point of view or an omniscient narrator, or they will do a third person limited with multiple characters, sometimes as many as a dozen or more. And I know that that can feel a little bit overwhelming. How do you even structure a story when it comes to this? So let's get into these tips. First is to know why you're doing it. Obviously, any story is going to have multiple characters in it. But why do we need to see what's inside this person's head and this person's perspective? Why do we need to get this person's voice, this person's knowledge? Why does this particular character deserve to have their own part of the story told? There's lots of reasons behind this. It could be that this particular character has secrets that other people don't know. It could be that this character or multiple characters are split up throughout the story and you can't tell the full story just from one person's point of view. There are lots of different reasons that we might see this. It might be to add tension to the story, to add dimension to the story, to add different perspectives or diversity to your story, but make sure that you have a reason other than just, you've got this one main character and then you've got a bunch of side characters that just add flavor to the story. It really needs to go deeper than that, where each character has an arc, they have a reason, they have a personality and something distinct about them that is adding to the story. Just to give an example of this really quickly, in my series, The Shadow Demon Saga, I started out with a single point of view. Harper is the main character and the only point of view character in the first 6 books, which means that everything we see in this story is stuff that Harper knows and has experienced. So we can't see or know anything that she hasn't experienced, because that's the limit that we see when we are going through a limited point of view. When I got to the 6th book and there was a bigger battle and the world had expanded, I realized that I was holding myself back as this world became more of a fantasy world. This is really a portal fantasy in essence. And I realized it was limiting myself and my way of telling that story. So I decided once we get to book 7 to do something a little bit unorthodox, but that's the beauty of being an indie author. I can make those kinds of creative decisions. I split it out into 4 different points of view. So in book 6 through right now 11, going to be working on the final book 12 soon, you do get more points of view, and it is 4 main points of view. And even sometimes I do split out to a 5th or 6th point of view in some of the stories. And that allows my world to be so much richer, because I can have Jackson in one location that Harper's not there. And we as readers can still see what's happening, because when we're limited to Harper's point of view, we can't possibly know what Jackson's doing on the other side of the world or in a shadow world unless they were communicating in some way. So this way, it allows me to add more depth to the world and more plot and beefier stakes and all kinds of stuff. So I am a big fan of multiple POV. You just need to think about, what am I trying to achieve by showing this story from multiple perspectives? Tip number 2 is that it is usually best to write each chapter from a single point of view. You will see sometimes that you'll have maybe a page break or something or a scene break, and then you'll switch POV. Stephen King sometimes does this. So you will see this done well. But for the most part, it is easier on readers when we say this chapter is this person's point of view, which allows us to anchor that chapter into that person's head or that person's thought or experiences without head hopping. One of the biggest mistakes that you will see authors making when it comes to multiple POV is that they'll be really anchored into a certain character's perspective, and we'll hear their thoughts and we'll be in a close or limited point of view with them. And all of a sudden, we'll also hear Jackson's thoughts, and then Jackson will start to take over the scene. And this is called head hopping, where you really are getting almost whiplash from whose point of view are we actually in? Because if we're in, let's say, Harper's point of view, she can't hear what Jackson's thinking. And so when the narrator tells us what Jackson's thinking, it's a bit of a cheat, or it's a bit of a head hop. And there is omniscient point of view, and we're going to get into tense in just a minute. But when you are writing in some kind of close or limited point of view, then you need to make sure that you're anchoring each chapter, or at least each section of a chapter, each scene, in one single person's point of view, so that you're not confusing your reader, or you're not giving them whiplash because they're hearing this person's thoughts, but then this person. Readers like to know whose head they're in, whose eyes they're seeing the story through. So make sure that you try to keep at the very least, each scene to one person's point of view, or what I prefer to do is to write each chapter from one single point of view. Tip number 3 does address this idea of tense and what perspective you're telling the story from. And I could make an entire series on this. So if I'm going a little bit fast, feel free to ask questions down in the comments. But when we are writing multiple POV, a lot of times what readers like to see is a limited point of view. Now, you will see a lot of books such as the Harry Potter series or multiple fantasy series where you have an omniscient narrator, meaning that the omniscient narrator knows everything. They can see each individual character's thoughts. They can see the story from anyone's perspective. They can come out and see this eagle-eye view of what's happening across the entire world or universe. That is an omniscient narrator. Then you will also see a third person limited point of view or perspective where the narrator can only see what this one character is thinking. This is the type of writing that I like to do, where I don't usually write omniscient. I usually write from a limited POV. So for example, my Eternal Sorrow series has multiple points of view. Each chapter is in a different person's point of view and is actually labeled with the character's name. So we'll get into that in another tip. And then it's in third person. So it's third person past tense, but it's a limited tense, meaning when we are in a chapter that features Crash, all we can see and hear is what Crash sees and hears. When you have an omniscient narrator, they can see what all the characters are thinking, but it's not always the best case scenario to keep your story high level like that, where you've got an omniscient narrator that can hear everyone's thoughts. Because like I said in the previous tip, readers like to be anchored in someone's eyes or someone's point of view. And so when you get really good at writing, to be honest, this type of writing scares me a little bit, but it is pretty common in fantasy writing. You will see a beginning of a chapter start out a little bit more omniscient, and then we'll kind of zero in to a more limited point of view. And if you want to see more videos and examples of this, I'll be happy to make more videos. But I think one of the most important things you can do is to decide which perspective you're telling your story from. Is it going to be first person past tense with a limited POV, like my Shadow Demon saga, where each chapter is a different character's perspective and it's told in the first person, like I saw this, I said this? Or is it going to be third person limited perspective where you say, she said this, Harper walked across the room, and we're a little bit separated from the character's head and we're in third person? Or are you going to mix it up a little bit? So sometimes in some books, especially you'll see this in like murder mysteries or detective mysteries, you may have the detective in first person past tense with a very limited perspective where we're just seeing things through the detective's eyes. But then the villain or the killer might be in third person, or the killer might be in second person even. And that is really unusual, but it's interesting to see that. So some chapters are in different types of perspectives, and that can be a good choice to make. But just be aware, again, of why you're doing it and what is the effect that you're trying to achieve. Let every single choice here be intentional and have a reason behind it. Whether you're trying to affect the tone, trying to affect the storytelling, give it some thought and try to decide which perspective you're going to be in and which tense you're going to be in, and then make sure that you're consistent with that throughout the entire book. So, for example, you wouldn't want to have your villain's chapters in third person and then all of a sudden do a villain chapter in first person. You would want to stay consistent with those choices throughout the entire book. Which leads us to the fourth tip, which is to be very clear whose head we're in at the beginning of the chapter. When a reader turns the page to a brand new chapter, they will still be in the mindset and in the eyes of the person they were just in. So if chapter 2 is in Harper's point of view, their mind is going to be calibrated to Harper's personality and her thoughts and what she's been going through, what situation we're leaving her in. So when they turn the page to chapter 3, they're already going to be predisposed to think in Harper's point of view. So if you're switching, we need to be really clear about who we're switching to and what situation they're currently in. Where are they? What's the timeline here? And anchor that in right away. So what I like to do there is the second you turn the page, you've got not only the title of the chapter, but you have the name of the protagonist here. So you turn the chapter, you see that it's Jackson. And this is pretty common to name the chapter or to head the chapter with the character's name. You don't always have to do that. I mentioned Stephen King earlier. If you've ever read some of his ensemble casts, like my favorite, The Stand or Under the Dome or It, you'll notice that even though he's changing point of view quite often, he does anchor us into that character pretty quickly. So he's usually writing third person, close or limited point of view, and he'll just name the character. He'll say something like, Jackson Hunt walked across the lonely highway, so that we know not only what we're seeing in our head, but also who we're seeing or who is talking here. And this is super important to get your reader to actually like your multiple POV story. It's crucial that the reader turns the page and with every single switch, you anchor them into who is speaking and what is going on with that character visually so that they can immediately begin to see it. So many characters experience our books like movies running through their head. And so if we don't tell them where they are and give them a visual of who it is and what situation they're in right now, it can really confuse the reader. Tip number 5 is to make each voice unique, which doesn't have to actually be over the top, but to give each character really distinct characteristics, distinct things that they always say or that they're thinking about, distinct ways of speaking, so that we always can tell, even if you didn't give us a name, who we're seeing the story through right now. So giving your character some kind of quirk, giving them a specific voice. So you might have, particularly in a romance, let's say, you might have grumpy sunshine trope. So every time we're in that guy's point of view and he's grumpy, we're going to get a harsher, rougher way of thinking, a more negative way or that type of perspective. Whereas if we're in the female sunshine, happy point of view, she's always going to be looking on the positive side of things, and the way she speaks in her own mind will naturally sound very different. And so giving your characters a particular and distinct voice can be also very important in making sure that we're anchoring the reader in the feel and tone and style of that character. Tip number 6 is to consider focusing on one main character. So a lot of times when we have an ensemble cast, you will see that each individual character has their own personality and they're very distinct, but usually there's one main character, and it's often the character we meet first, that the main part of the story is introduced. So if you think about The Walking Dead, it's Rick. Like, Rick is the main character of that series. And even though we often are in Michonne's point of view or we're in Daryl's point of view and we get to see their stories and their backstories, Rick is the main character. He's the main dude, right? And we see so many of the turning points of the story, the beginnings and the ends of series or seasons fall on this one character who is the main hero of the story. And a lot of times this is another way to anchor readers into the actual plot of the story. The Wheel of Time, for example, is one of my favorite series of all time. There are dozens of point of view characters throughout that entire series, but we all know that Rand is the main character, and that is the person that we see not necessarily first in the story, but he's the first one that we really get his deep, close perspective. And that's often how we anchor readers into our story. In my Eternal Sorrow series, it's Parrish. In my Demon series, it's Harper. And everybody kind of is able to know that when Harper is on screen, it's really her story they're most emotionally connected with. And even though you may have other characters that you begin to love, you do sort of see that story. In The Stand, it's Stu Redman. We see him as one of the first people to encounter the virus in The Stand, and we follow him throughout, and it's his story we're most anchored into. But Franny is my favorite character. So you give people those different perspectives, but you anchor the plot line with one main character. This is not always true for romances, though. For those of you that are romance authors, you know that really both main characters, if you're telling dual POV there with romances, have their own full story arc and they're fully fleshed out characters. So that's one way that romance can differ in multiple POV from an ensemble cast. But the seventh tip is to not feel like you have to alternate every single chapter. So if you had 4 points of view, you don't have to feel like each chapter goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 in a round robin style. And this is one of the biggest mistakes I will see people make right from the start, is that they feel they have to keep it balanced. There's 10 chapters in each person's point of view, or 5 chapters in each, and we have to go alternating. And you don't even have to do this in romance where you have maybe 2 points of view. It doesn't have to be, female, male, or, whatever type of romance you're writing, male, whatever. But it doesn't have to alternate that way. Sometimes it makes more sense for us to see this particular character, number 1, going through 3 different experiences before we move on to character number 2. So don't feel like hindered by this idea that you have to alternate or you have to keep them balanced. Remember that I was just talking about there often is that one main character. And sometimes we will see that main character in more scenes than we will anyone else. In The Wheel of Time, for example, in that very first book, The Eye of the World, Rand is by far the character we're in his head the most. That isn't always true of later books. And in fact, there is a later book in the series where I don't think we even get Rand's point of view at all, even though he's really the main hero of the story. We see him the most in that first book because the author is really trying to anchor the story in Rand's point of view, Rand's story. He's setting him up as the hero. And we won't go into a Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, because he definitely broke some rules there with Ned, but that's a conversation for another day. The main thing is just understanding that each scene needs to have a purpose. It needs to follow that idea of a character's goal, their conflict, what's holding them back from achieving their goal, and their outcome. If you are not familiar with this breakdown of scenes from goal, conflict, outcome, I have a great video for you that I will link down below, or I will put up here in the cards for you to check out about writing scenes in this way. And in fact, I have an entire series here on YouTube with a free workbook that you can download all about creating scenes. Just make sure in your multiple POV novels that each scene has a purpose and that you're telling it from the perspective of the character who has the most at stake, who has the most interesting part of the story, who has the most emotional reaction to what's going on. It is pivotal that we don't try to just have filler chapters where it's like, well, Jackson was next in the rotation, so I had to have a chapter with him, even though nothing much is happening. Every single scene needs to have a purpose, even if it means you don't see Jackson for 6 chapters. Tip number 8 is that each character will often have their own fully fleshed out character arc, their own fully fleshed out backstory, and they see themselves as the hero of their own story, right? So even in The Wheel of Time, Rand might be the main character to us as readers, but Perrin believes he is the main character of his own story because it is his own life. And so each character, if you really want to tell it well and make it compelling, needs to have their own personality, their own full character arc, and they need to go through what we know as the hero or the heroine's journey. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we as readers will see every detail of each character's arc, because we would end up with books that are 500,000 words plus long. It's just that we as authors need to know what's going on with those characters, even if all of those scenes don't make it on screen or on the page, so to speak. Also, what I have found with writing a longer series, 12, I'm on book 12 now, with multiple characters as POV characters, is that oftentimes a character like Airden, for example, he gets a full character arc, but it doesn't always span a single book. Sometimes it spans 3 books before we see his fleshed out character arc. And so I would love to do a series talking a little bit more about this, because I feel like it's something I've learned through doing and reading a lot, but it's not something that there's many books or articles written about. So if you want to see more in detail about how to actually structure a series with multiple points of view, please let me know in the comments. Tip number 9 is really more of an observation that one of the most difficult parts of writing an ensemble cast or multiple POVs is weaving them together in a way that really resonates with your style, with your genre, and with your readers themselves. So I write young adult, portal fantasy, young adult contemporary fantasy, and I love twists and turns. And in fact, my readers have lovingly named my cliffhangers Sarra hangers, because I leave them basically on a dun 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 kind of moment at the end of every single chapter. And that's one of the reasons that I love playing with multiple POV so much, is because I can have Harper going through this situation of she has a goal, there's a conflict, and then the outcome is a cliffhanger that will lead her into her next goal and conflict. But I leave her hanging and I move on to another character's POV who might be in a completely different place. And my favorite authors are brilliant at being able to take us to a climax moment for a character, leave them hanging, and leave me like dying to turn pages really fast to see what happens to that character next. But then also anchoring me immediately in another character's point of view and getting me interested in them, where I'm all over the map. I love this character and can't wait to see what happens next, but I love this character too. And so you want to make sure that you're weaving these points of view together in a way that leaves your reader feeling exactly the way you want them to feel. And that is going to be very genre dependent. So the way you might want to leave someone in a women's fiction multiple POV book at the end of every chapter might be very different than the way you want someone to feel at the end of your murder mystery chapters or your horror chapters. So really think about genre when it comes to this. And I know I've just barely touched on some of these items, but hopefully this has been helpful for you. And if you want to see a lot more on writing multiple POV and tips on this, then please make sure that you're subscribed, hit the like button, and comment down below and let me know if you're writing multiple POV, if you're interested in writing multiple POV, and any questions that you might have. Just briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I am doing this in my own current work in progress, which is a standalone YA thriller called The Disappearance of Vanessa Shaw. So let's take a look. Okay, step into my writing room with me where I have my entire plot figured out on my wall. So if you want to see how I did this, I will link my video down below, but I basically just took easel paper and rolled it out and taped it onto my wall. And I use sticky notes to visually be able to plot my story. And for me, this is super important and super helpful, especially the color coding and the visual of how the scenes flow together when it comes to multiple points of view, because it's just more complex type of story to organize. So I would love to go more in depth in this if you guys want to see more in the future, but for today, I'm just going to give you a high level overview. So you can see I have Act 1, Act 2, Part 1, Act 2, Part 2. So that means this part is the midpoint of the book. And then we have the conclusion, Act 3, climax and resolution on the bottom. And I have divided each act with a little piece of washi tape here, because the way that I have decided to handle multiple POV in this particular story is that we have not only multiple points of view, but we have multiple timelines. So one timeline is present tense. So that is the top of this line here. And you can see that every post-it note on that line is purple, because in the present day, we have just one point of view. So Lorelei, who is my main character that the whole story is anchored in, she is the only point of view that we see in the present day timeline. In the past, though, we also have a timeline of the summer leading up to the day that Vanessa disappeared. And in that past timeline, which is the bottom section here of my each act of the board, we have multiple points of view, which is why you start to see all these different colors here. And the way that I've decided to structure this story is that we have Lorelai in the present, and she is introduced right from the start as the sleuth of our story. She's the one who's trying to figure out and can't let go, like what actually happened to Vanessa, and it's still up in the air. And she believes that the people who were there that night Vanessa disappeared know more about what really happened than what they've ever told anyone. And so now what's happening is it's a year since Vanessa disappeared, and everyone who was there that night is getting together again to honor her memory as they're all graduating from high school. And so Lorelai knows that this is her chance to really investigate and find out what happened. And there's really high stakes here for her, which I'll go into when I talk about this story a little bit more. But basically, this is like, I need to figure this out to be able to move on with my life. And so she's looking for clues and she's looking for answers to the questions about what really happened. And so the way I'm anchoring these past timeline POVs is that all of these same people are there with her in the present, but we're only seeing the present tense from her perspective. But every time something happens that triggers a memory of what happened that night, we go into the past and we get to see these different characters and what really happened. And so in this way, I'm weaving these together by something in the present triggers a past memory, but it's not Lorelai's memory. It's a memory of the other people that are there that night. And slowly, each person there has some kind of secret that gets revealed until finally we find out who it is that maybe was responsible for Vanessa's disappearance. So it's a murder mystery. It's got a little bit of supernatural elements, a little bit of elements of unreliable narrator. And this has been a really fun book to figure out, but hopefully you can see from the tips that I kind of came up with a framework here of present day is one single POV. The past tense is all everyone else's point of view. We do get Lorelai in the past as well. And so we know when we're in someone besides Lorelai that we're anchored somewhere in the summer before Vanessa disappeared. This is very unlike any other story that I've done, but it does hopefully show you a little bit of how flexible and interesting multiple POV can be. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for sticking around. If you love tips on writing and organizing and planning your life, going after your dreams, then I hope that you'll stick around and subscribe here and become part of our Hearties community. Also, if you are interested in writing multiple POV and this is something that you're currently working on, I would love for you to check out my other video on how I plan a novel using multiple POV, and I've got all the fun color coding tips for you. So I will leave that link here on the screen as well as down in the description, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye.